I wanted to start off by mentioning something. I read your book, Hijito, and there's a poem that really spoke to me.
Sure.
It's called Pronounced.
Yes, yes.
And if you don't mind, I'd like to read like 2 stanzas from that poem.
Absolutely.
That really hit home. It goes, "You are still trying to retrieve the sounds you once dreamt in. You hardly remember your mother tongue. You are trying to pull something usable from the wreckage, yet it all feels familiar. Your best friend compliments your clean pronunciation, the way you have learned to let go of everything you once called home." I love it. It's so like it spoke to me because to be honest, I've my mother tongue is Arabic, and at some point during my life I kind of started losing it, and English was creeping in.
Yes.
For whatever reasons.
Yes.
And I find myself currently now in a state of like trying to salvage my Arabic language from the wreckage.
Yep.
So I was wondering, what is your story with your mother tongue?
Yes. Oh my gosh. I'm so moved and honored that it spoke to you in that way. I mean, that's the hope with any poem. I think that writing something that's so highly personal oftentimes does resonate with something that's universal and that can speak across time and space and language and experience. So for me, English is actually my third language. And yet my dominant language. And yet the language that I mostly operate in now. So my first languages were Portuguese and Spanish. I lived in Brazil when I was very little, and I've forgotten all of my Portuguese, and I forgot a lot of my Spanish, got a lot of it back, lost it, got a bunch back. Wow. It's still in process. And I think part of that was, in my context, was my father arrived in the United States as an immigrant from Colombia when he was 13 years old in 1961. He didn't speak a word of English. In that era, his parents just threw him in a school and said, "Go figure it out." And everyone spoke English. And of course, he failed all the classes because he didn't speak the language. And, and so I think whether it was conscious or...
That's so unheard of. Like, imagine that happening today.
Oh my gosh. No, I know. But I think that whether it was conscious or subconscious, I think that when I was operating and playing with my sister and we were speaking Portuguese, or I was thinking in Spanish or whatever it was, I think there was a part of my father that, whether consciously or subconsciously, panicked and feared that I would experience what he went through, feeling alienated because he did not speak English, or feeling othered, or being disparaged, or being excluded. And so I remember getting to a point when I was 5 years old and they said, "Only English. We only speak English." And that's when I started to lose those 2 other languages. And so I have a very complicated, loaded relationship to language generally. And it's one of those things people say, "Oh yeah, so what's your dominant language?" Or "What do you speak Spanish?" And it's, my Spanish is a lot better than I lead on, but I have a very complicated relationship with it because of that. And this is a great, that poem is capturing, actually, that was a real thing that my best friend in 5th grade when I was 10 years old said to me. And it was like a sword that he thought was a compliment, Yeah. And it was something that was sort of highlighting this profound grief and loss that I felt, that he saw as something that was a positive. And I think that's something that a lot of children of immigrants can relate to, or a lot of people who live in sort of multicultural, fractured, culturally displaced or misplaced upbringings, I think, and beyond, obviously. But I think it's something that I've had a lot of people who've read that poem or who've heard that poem have approached me about, and they've said, "Oh my gosh, that's my experience with Tagalog or Cantonese or Arabic." So that means a lot.
Yeah, beautiful. I also was wondering, like, since it probably hits home with a lot of people, whenever you're sitting down and writing poetry, do you ever think of how far and wide your poem is going to reach?
Wow.
Where, like, just like in my case, halfway around the world?
I mean, no. I think if I thought about that, I think it would probably stop the process. I mean, you never know. I mean, it's also counterintuitive. There are poems that you think no one will see, and that becomes the poem that resonates with people everywhere, and vice versa. So I think for me, I always start with, maybe it's like a single image or a single picture or a single exchange or maybe a word or a concept, and I kind of slowly sort of interrogate that and build out from there. But I have clear ideas in different poems about who I'm speaking to or what I'm holding up to the light, but I'm never thinking, okay, I hope this, or I'm planning for this poem to have 2 million people read it or whatever. I think I'm always starting with something small that I'm looking at very closely and then holding up to the light. And to me, I think that's counterintuitively or paradoxically the way that I think my poems often have the most profound and universal resonance, is when I look at something very specifically or in a way that's highly personal. I think those are the poems that paradoxically are the ones that people deeply resonate with, and they'll say, oh my gosh, I'm not Colombian or Latino or speak Spanish, but I'm Yemeni and I feel the same way about that.
Yeah, totally. I even thought of that when you had multiple accounts of gunshots in your poetry book, and like gunshots is not a big thing in our region. You never hear of it. But it's still like it thunders through your poems, and you can relate to it.
Absolutely.
Is there a story behind how you got into poetry?
Yes, there actually is. So when I was 17 years old, I hid it from almost everyone. It was hidden from almost everyone I knew besides my best friend and my girlfriend at the time. But I'd been writing poems for 6 months and having a little bit of an identity crisis about it, because I'd been a basketball player up to that point in my life. I didn't think of myself as an artist or a writer. And this great poet by the name of Martín Espada came to my high school and read from his book, Imagine the Angels of Bread. And it was the first time I heard a poet that felt like he was reading pages out of a journal I had buried in my chest. And I'd never been so moved. And after that day and after that performance, I recognized that I could not live without poetry. And I think it became a way for me to survive a very difficult time in my life. And after that performance, I walked up to Martín and bought a copy of his book. And he looked at me. I could barely eke out my name. And he took the book and he wrote, Para Carlos, Poeta del Futuro Martín Espada, which means for Carlos, poet of the future. And he ultimately gave me permission to embrace my identity as a poet and as a writer. And coming full circle, nearly 20 years later, he's the person who wrote the introduction to Hijito. So it's been incredible to think about that journey and things coming full circle. He's someone who I had the opportunity to do some readings with and sort of kept in touch with over the years, and been a kind of mentor in some ways. And I think who I am today as a writer in many ways has been made possible by Martín Espada, by others. But I think if I was to pick one person and say this person is the main reason I'm a writer, I would have to say Martín Espada.
Amazing. Shout out to Martinez then.
Shout out to Martín.
This is a question I ask a lot of people, poets and poetry lovers, and I get different answers all the time. Do you think a poet is born a poet, or do you think the environment nurtures him to become a poet? Wow, that's a great question. I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, I'll say for me, I think I was made a poet by the circumstances of my childhood. I lived in 4 countries. I juggled 7, 8 different languages. I went to 12 different schools before I graduated high school. And so most of my childhood was spent as an outsider, as kind of a culturally displaced kid, as somebody who knew what it was like to come home at the end of a school day and have no friends. And I think that instilled in me this, I think, comfort with both being by myself, but also being somebody who watched and observed, and also complicated my perceptions of those around me. Because I think I didn't have the luxury of being somebody who belonged socially and being able to sort of cast people aside. I think I had to sort of challenge my assumptions and be more open to, I don't know, I guess embracing the varied dimensions of the people around me, because I wasn't somebody who had a lot of like social leverage until later in my life and later in my schooling. But yeah, I think just
just watching and listening really carefully. There's nothing like being left out or being an outsider that will force you to find creative ways to fill that time and that space. And even I think the grief that comes along with being on the outside. And so I think for me, the way that I guess built meaning out of feeling on the outside was I watched people and I noticed the small little moments and the little glimpses of things that were easy to overlook or that often other people would not catch. But me, because I wasn't, I didn't have a lot of things distracting me or pulling me away. I could just watch this person by themselves, pushing that apple across the table in the cafeteria to that other kid, So I think I'll just say in my case, I can't speak for everybody else. I'm not everybody else, but I speak for me. Maybe there was a poet always in there meant to come out. Maybe it wouldn't have come out if I didn't have my childhood, but my childhood definitely, I think, demanded that I develop the eye that I think as a watcher and as an observer that I know for my own artistic practice is vital. Yeah. And you see it now. So much of my work is autobiographically, at least oriented in some way, at least as a springboard. And many of them are just personal narratives that are told through a poem. So you definitely see that, I think, play out in a lot of my work, particularly the last few years.
Yeah, I like the awareness of the awareness that you have in how you came up to this point. It's really, really insightful, actually.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's opening my mind into some things of how maybe I got here as well.
Yeah.
Do you see yourself performing a ritual inside your head before you go on stage? Or is it just Carlos the entire time?
Wow, that's a great question. I think just because of how many readings I've done, just the amount of repetitions and it being thousands upon thousands at this point, I think in a lot of those scenarios, I used to have rituals to prepare, but I think that was disrupted so many times, as is often the case when people do things thousands of times, that I sort of let go of those rituals. I think if there's any ritual, I think that there's kind of an immense stillness that I become rooted in my body, in my literal and figurative body when I get up in front of an audience. And I don't know, for me, I think the process of performing is kind of like meditative play and just being intensely present and trying to authentically and genuinely live in my body and be open to this moment of connecting with the people in front of me. So yeah, I guess that's the only ritual I can think is just being rooted in an epic stillness that I find extremely replenishing and also just enthralling.
Yeah, I really like that phrase, epic stillness. It really does describe the moment that you step on stage, because there's just this silence and everyone's just like, all right, come on, we're waiting for you. And you're like, you guys have no idea what I got in store for you.
I love it.
Yeah, it's I've learned a lot, to be honest, during my very small career in performance.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, every moment is a learning experience.
Yes,
every repetition, every time up there. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the poem that you might have performed like already 3 times or 4, 5, 6.
Sure.
Is changing and evolving.
Yeah, it's never the same. Absolutely.
And I think that's very important to like not stay rigid on how your poem is going to be performed.
I never do that. I always say one of the most important things for me is I never replicate anything. Everything I do is the first and last time I will do it. Mm-hmm. And I think a good sign of that is I love when I've done a poem that I've done many times and someone will say, who knows me and knows my work, will say, wow, what's that poem called? I've never heard that poem before. And I'll say, you've heard that poem about 5 times. But that's brilliant that you don't believe that you've heard it, which means that it was so new and so fresh that it almost took on a life of its own as though it was a new poem. So, I think that's the magic of just being present. And also I try to listen to the moments that are just kind of emerging as I'm going along in a piece. And sometimes, in the great moments, I'll surprise myself or something will happen in the space that'll change the trajectory of what I thought I was going to do. Yeah.
Which book have you gifted the most?
That I've gifted the most to people. Oh my gosh. Wow. I think one of them is definitely my favorite novel of all time, which is by my favorite writer of all time, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. there's something about that novel that resonates so profoundly with me, and also I think in so many different ways is such an invitation towards humanity and resilience and dismantling the toxic and horrific systems and paradigms of thinking that I think try to terrorize our own sense of self-worth. And obviously the poem centers Black girls and Black women, as so much of Toni Morrison's work does. But it's really profound that a book that does that, I also feel speaks very much to my experience in different ways. Although I'll never know what it's like, obviously, to be a Black girl or a Black woman. Mm-hmm. But it's very profound. My father, I remember asking my father a number of years ago, I said, "What's your favorite book?" And he said, "The Bluest Eye" by Toni Morrison. And I remember being shocked by that. Colombian-Immigrant, came to the United States when he was 13, and in 1961, and he points to this book and says that's his favorite book of all time. That I think speaks to work, again, which I think is something that I try to do, hopefully, so highly personal and specific, and yet can resonate so far beyond the maybe perceived demographic limitations. I mean, in that time period in particular with Toni Morrison, and see that it resonates with me, the son and the father, and Colombian-Immigrant, and people who come from a wide range of identities and backgrounds and experiences. So yeah, I would say the Bluest Eye. There are other ones, but I think that's probably the one.
Cool.
Yeah.
Have you been to Colombia a lot?
I have many times. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And have you seen the poetry scene?
You know what? Colombia? Actually, interestingly enough, I've never gone there and checked out the poetry scene.
Okay.
And maybe that's because I go there to be with family, and True. My family is not trying to go to the the open mic. There are kind of like prescribed rhythms. Yeah. Of time with family.
Yes.
But I think that's something for my next trip to Colombia. I definitely will seek it out. There is the Medellin International Poetry Festival. My father's and his family are actually from Medellin in Antioquia in Colombia, and that festival I think is probably at the top of my bucket list as a dream festival to visit someday. I've never performed in South America before, though I've traveled many times to South America. So
it would be coming around as well.
It would be coming full circle, right? Yeah. I mean, to be where my father was born, and where the family has such deep and profound ties. So I think that's my next trip to Colombia. That is, I need to check out the poetry scene, definitely.
Beautiful. Okay, so what about the poetry scene in New York?
Oh yeah. Oof.
Oh man.
Yeah.
I'd love to get a taste of that.
Oh my gosh.
Tell me, what is it?
No, it's incredible. I mean, it's something that I said. It was a friend's book launch actually last Saturday, and I was there just for one night. And I was saying to a lot of my friends who've come up through the poetry scene, for a solid decade, for 10 years, I went to poetry probably about 3 nights a week for 10 years.
3 nights
a week for 10 years.
Wow.
And so every Monday I'd go to Bar 13. Every Thursday I'd go to the Bowery Poetry Club, and every Friday I'd go to the New Eurekan Poets Cafe. And just to think about, the kind of people that I would just be standing alongside in the venue were incredible. You know what I mean? And these are poets now who've won National Book Awards and Pulitzers, and gone on to be icons and legends, from, Patricia Smith, Ross Gay, Tyimba Jess, Rachel McKibbins, so many different people. All these people, I think, to think about on any given night, that was just normal being out in New York. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of sharpens you in a particular kind of way that I don't think any other space could do in the same way. So I think I feel an immense amount of gratitude, and I think even now I'm still trying to sort of catch up to the just how miraculous it was that I was able to just reside in that space and believe it was normal.
Yeah. When you started off doing performing in New York, was it as big as it is now, or has it grown?
Wow. I mean, I suppose it goes in waves. I mean, obviously the scene has evolved and changed, And I think every literary scene kind of moves and evolves. And there are also things that we have now that did not exist when I was initially in the scene. I mean, for much of that decade, YouTube did not exist.
True.
There
Yes.
was not social media. So there were things that I think have influenced and shaped the aesthetics of how poetry exists in the more sort of popular consciousness that in that scene just was not a factor. And I think in many ways that allowed the community to be a lot more cohesive in ways that I think that cohesion has been perhaps made more difficult, because people at home can sit home and on YouTube they feel like they can watch 2,000 poems if they want to.
Yeah, true.
or they can from all over the world. In that era, if you wanted to watch poetry, you had to go see it. You know? And then when you did that enough, the people who saw your work would say, do you have a new poem? So you were constantly generating new work to not feel like you were letting down everyone who saw you every week.
True.
So so I think that really as we say, in New York and in the States, it helped me like cut my teeth. It helped me build my chops, and not just doing that, but also, I grew up performing at the Apollo and performing at other venues around New York. And so,
Wow,
New York
impressive.
is ruthless. You know what I mean? If you don't command a space, I mean, they will chew you up and spit you out. So you have to have a really clear sense about your purpose when you get up there every time, or you might literally be booed off the stage by 5,000 people at the Apollo, which I've experienced. You know what I mean?
Really?
I've won at the Apollo and gotten a standing ovation, and I've been booed off in 9 seconds. So I've experienced both extremes, and I think that's all part of that.
I'd hate to focus on a negative experience, but can you please
it was a very
elaborate?
It was a very positive experience. And the
Okay.
funny thing too, which I think is also a really important lesson about being up in front of an audience, is the reason I got booed off actually had nothing to do with the poem that I had. I actually didn't even get to the poem. So there's this it's kind of this iconic sacred kind of what would I call it? It's this sacred piece of a trunk called the Tree of Hope at the Apollo. And when every person that walks on stage is supposed to rub the Tree of Hope for good luck. And also as a sign of respect to all the greats who've gone through the Apollo in its 90-year history. And I was so enthusiastic to get out there and get up in front of the mic that I walked past the Tree of Hope and forgot to rub it.
Oh my
So
God.
and then I went back to rub it. And by that time, I had this feeling of just sort of turning my back, and the Apollo has all the things going up, and about 5,000 people sold out. And the booing was so loud that I could feel the boos hitting off the wall behind me, and it felt like somebody, like 1,000 hands slapping me on my back. That's how loud.
Ricocheting off the back.
That's how loud the
Yeah.
sound was of the booing.
Wow.
And but it was a great experience. I mean, I cherish. I think generally in my journey, I cherish the rejections. I cherish the spectacular failures. I've had a lot of markers that people would think are, people might point to and say are successes, or things that gesture towards me moving in the right direction. But I mean, for every one of those instances, there are, literally hundreds of epic failures. And I think those are things that make me, all those repetitions make me feel resilient and prepared on any stage I step into. I don't feel like any stage is too big, because I've been in enough moments where I've, been spectacular in succeeding, or in my own mind, or been present or commanded the room. And as many times or more, I've also spectacularly failed. So I think that gives me a permission to kind of let go of a lot of that.
It's honestly really good that you have an honest gauge of when you don't do well. You have people coming out and telling you you're not.
Oh yeah,
you're not hitting us the way you should be.
Oh yeah, in New York you'll know quickly,
which is good. Yeah, that's amazing.
Because
that's how you built your craft. Right?
It's a rare gift. Yeah, no, it's a really profound gift to get that feedback. I mean, so much of my artistic career, I'm very grateful for having not just random people, but also like a lot of mentors who had the thought and the generosity to tell me when things just were not working, or to point me towards things that I needed to help build my tools, whether as a performer or as a writer.
Absolutely, which takes me to my next question. What are your thoughts on mentorship? And does it come in other forms other than like an individual?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I would also like to hear your thoughts on how would you go about seeking mentors?
Wow, that's a great question. I think mentorship is, I mean, when I think about whether, it's like me trying to grow as a man or trying to grow as a writer, it is only made possible because of the generosity of mentors that have helped guide me and helped challenge me and hold me accountable and nurtured me and supported me through difficult moments. I think for me, a lot of the mentorship that I experienced and then I think I hopefully paid back to younger generations as I got older and developed through the scene was when I first came into the scene. In 1999, I first went into the New York Poets Cafe, and I was a 17-year-old high schooler, and with very undeveloped tools and as a performer, and I had, writers and poets from the older generation, which in poetry meant like 10 years older than me, who were 27. And they were very generous and sort of pulling me aside and supporting me, but also challenging me and also demanding more and also demanding that and they would hand me books and say, oh, go read this. You should read this. Or, you know what, your poem ends there. Don't keep going. Or you know what, when you got up there, why were you doing this? And then having me interrogate things that maybe I hadn't really reflected on, that I just sort of had done impulsively. And so I think that's something that I always kept in my head. And then when I was 27 or I was 29, I would see some of those younger poets doing many of the things that I did, and I tried to pay that forward. So I think it was more, particularly in the New York scene, was more of an organic thing. There wasn't really a process or a protocol. It was more just, we're here every week. We have a certain kind of candor and a certain kind of trust with each other that's built from the kind of cohesion of this, or the sort of cohesive bond we have in this community. So it would just sort of happen organically. But again, I think that's changed in some ways. Like even what you're doing now is really incredible. I've heard that there's the attendance has been kind of dropping in a lot of the U.S. at poetry events, and so that becomes more difficult. I'm a strong proponent of believing that for the kind of intensive mentorship that's required, an actual physical space where you are present with each other and it can happen in some kind of organic format, that for me feels like the most profound way that it can happen. But the world that we live in is that's becoming more difficult. I know there are virtual ways that can happen. 2 years ago when I graduated from my MFA program, I had supervisors, faculty members who I corresponded with we would write letters to each other. And that was a really profound, means of mentorship. But yeah, I don't know. I think there is something really powerful about having a physical space, a hub that you and other writers say, we have this general agreement that as long as, my sister is not getting married or I'm not working overtime, I'll be here every Monday, or I'll be here on the third Thursday of every month. And we come here and the agreement is we support each other and we challenge each other. And for those who've been around longer or those who are just stepping in, we're going to help each other. And we're going to build a kind of lineage here that we guard with a lot of passion and a lot of purpose and a lot of pride. And so I think, I don't know, when I think of mentorship, I mean, mentorship is everything. It's everything. It's to me, it's the most, it's one of the most generous expressions of legacy and lineage, is to say, I was 17 and the elders in that scene helped guide me, and now I'm seen as an elder in a way in this community. And so now I try to pay that forward with people who are just walking into this space, cotton-mouthed and wide-eyed like I did in 1999 in the New York Poets Cafe.
Beautiful.